Ready? Good evening, and welcome Wild Ones members and guests, and those who are joining us via our live stream. My name is Jeremy Mayberg. I'm president of Wild Ones Twin Cities, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And before we begin, I want to make a few introductions. First, our moderator tonight is Ren Graham. Ren has been a Wild One Twin Cities chapter leader in education for as long as I can remember. She worked with Marty Rice and others to develop an annual native plant and landscape education event. And the event evolved from a small expo over 18 years to become an all-day conference where I had the pleasure of getting to know Ren as a co-program chairs of the Design with Nature Conference. And our panel, who happen to be seated in exactly the order I'm going to introduce them. So if you would just raise your hand when I call your name. And you won't because you won't. Oh yeah, okay. Heather Holm actually needs no introduction to this group. She is a highly respected and well-known pollinator conservationist. She's a gifted photographer and an award-winning author. Heather's work brings the world of native pollinators up close and personal to us, and her research on pollinators has raised our awareness of the vital contribution they make to our ecosystem. She's an active community supporter. She's writing grants and coordinating and participating volunteer ecological restoration projects, and her latest project is a 13-acre oak savanna restoration that will provide thriving habitat for pollinators, birds, and mammals. Dan Tix is a senior restoration ecologist at the Minnesota Native Landscape Corporation. Over the past 25 years, he has provided valuable technical assistance for numerous projects affecting wetlands and vegetation and other natural resources. Dan is the principal investigator for the Conservation Grazing Project on solar sites and seeks to lead additional investigations that further ecological restoration and improve management and outcomes. Next is Andy Scott. Andy is the owner of Rewild Native Gardens, a nature-inspired landscape design company. He works with his clients to reshape their yards and gardens using native plants to become resilient, wildlife-friendly spaces. And he also serves on the Bloomington Sustainability Commission, advising the city council staff and communities on policy, practices, and proposals to sustain environmental resources. And finally, ecologist and author Bonnie Harper-Lore. Bonnie taught ecological principles at the University of Minnesota. She established the Minnesota Departments of Transportation's Native Wildflower Program, and then took the lessons learned from that program to the Federal Highway Administration, teaching all 50 state DOTs how to use native plants and control invasive species. Her latest project is a book compiled from many contributors titled Lessons Learned in Protecting and Restoring Biodiversity, Conservation in Action. At the back of the room is Julia Vanetta, Wild One Twin Cities past education chair, who along with Ren are the prime movers for bringing this evenings together for you. And of course, I want to thank the folks here at Oak Grove Presbyterian Church for graciously allowing us to host this event in this beautiful facility. And a special thanks to Randy Doppin back, the AV tech here at Oak Grove, for his invaluable assistance for the sound and video in this room, as well as the use of their first-class streaming capacity, allowing us to bring this program to all of you out there. And now let's get this party started. So because, like you, I can't wait to hear what the panel's thoughts are on what's in a bee balm. Ren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Sorry. Welcome, and thank you for joining Twin Cities Wild Ones in this beautiful sanctuary. As Jeremy, the Twin Cities president, mentioned, Wild Ones is a national nonprofit organization promoting the use and care of native plants at our homes, all the way to national wild areas. Native plants are the basis for habitat, sheltering wildlife, as well as eco-antidote for us to disconnect from our hectic daily lives and reconnect to nature. The image of walking in nature is well depicted in a National Geographic article, The Secret to Mindful Travel, A Walk in the Woods. Author Sonny Fitzgerald coined the term eco-antidote to describe our response to breathing in a forest. To me, it seems natural to ask the question, Why not include an antidote like this in our homes so we may benefit from eco-nurturing at our doorsteps? That inspiration to stop, take a breath, and wonder. The answer to this question has often been a spread of lawns. Now, lawns have their place in gathering, playing, and an easy area to walk. But let's take the question of eco-nurturing further. Golf courses, for example, have managed to successfully combine turf on the fairway with adjacent taller grasses and flowering plants called the rough. This rougher area frames the place to play at a glance, while defining the transition from turf to garden. In a neighborhood setting, this area may be described as bee lawn, pocket garden, short prairie, mini meadow, soft landing. These types of landscapes broaden the palette of what is added into your yard with selection of plants differing in heights, textures, and uses. The range and variation planted depends on your vision. It may be walkable, a relaxed destination, enjoyed from a distance, while at the same time creating space to sustain bees and pollinators. The Lawns to Legumes program opened the door to Plant for Pollinators with both coaching on what are appropriate native plant choices and where to purchase them. The program helped people take their ideas of a landscape to an in-the-ground accomplishment. Sage Passy, a Blue Thumb coach, described the program's effects. Overall, Lawns to Legumes initiated change through an empowered community, building connections that ultimately created a better and stronger ecosystem. We do this together and as individuals. It is disappointing that Lawns to Legumes will not be receiving funding this year, and concerned that many agencies are under closer scrutiny for support. We can do something. We can write and call our legislators, our governor, expressing the importance of this work and the positive change that has happened to our yards. The actions by our legislatures reinforces the reason for tonight's program, to explore what is a bee lawn. The bee lawn concept was developed at the University of Minnesota's Bee Lab and listed in the Lawns to Legumes for turf alternatives with flowers that may be mowed. The bee lawn is typically made up of non-native plants such as fine fescues, Dutch white clover, self-heal, and creeping thyme. Dutch white clover was introduced with settlers moving west and spreads easily. You may find it popping up in yards whether you desire it or not. The Twin Cities Wild Ones chapters believes this bee lawn does not meet the needs of native bees. The panelists tonight will address this question, which brings me to the panel. Briefly, the panels share their experiences on lawn alternatives in terms of style, care, and other considerations for the site's needs and the pollinators we wish to attract. We open with a 5-minute focused talk by each panelist, moving to a group discussion between the panelists with questions received prior to and during this event. Heather Holm is our first presenter, followed by Dan, Andy Scott, and Bonnie. I thank you for your time, and it is now, let's begin.
Thank you, Ren. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about bee lawns and alternatives to bee lawns. My name is Heather Holm, and I thought it might be helpful to start with a quick introduction on what is a bee lawn. Ren already talked about that. I'm trying to hopefully get my slide moving forward. See what happens. Oh, thank you. All right, well, you might not be able to read the text on this slide, but I just wanted to ground us all when we talk about creating pollinator plantings or plantings specifically for bees. The text on the slide says that we have over 512 species of bees here in Minnesota. And I always say, if I were to stop someone on the sidewalk just randomly and ask them, how many bees could you name? I think most people would be hard-pressed to name more than 5 bees. And so I just wanted to mention this to ground us in, this is what we're trying to achieve when we plant gardens for pollinators and bees alone. We have 512 species that we're trying to attract. Obviously, a home garden is not going to attract all 512, but we can really do a lot with certain types of plantings, this topic this evening. The other point on the slide that I have is that the importance of native plants. So approximately 40% of those 512 species of bees that we have here in Minnesota are pollen specialists of native plants. So that means a single female bee is just collecting a certain type of pollen from a certain plant, native plant. And so it really emphasizes the importance of incorporating as many native plants as possible as we can into our pollinator plantings. Oh, thank you. So breaking it down further, if I go back to that person on the sidewalk, I'm sure they probably would have mentioned honeybees as one of the bees that they could have named. And honeybees, as you can see on this slide, are very, very different than native bees. They're actually a non-native species. They are highly social. They nest in perennial colonies managed by humans. So we consider honeybees a domesticated species. And our wild or native bees are very different. The vast majority are solitary. The single female bee builds her nest by herself. She does all the work of collecting floral resources by herself and then does all of the egg laying. So it's a very, very different and contrasting lifestyle to the bee that most people are familiar with. I do want to mention, though, that since honeybees are non-native, that they do have some, can cause ecological concern. So again, they're not from North America. They're a non-native species. And as a species not native to North America, they have co-evolved with plants that aren't from North America. Thanks. And so they can cause ecological harm. And because a honeybee hive can have anywhere from 10 to 50,000 bees within it, that is a significant impact on the landscape on the floral resource extraction. A study demonstrated that just for the 3 months of June, July, and August, a single honeybee colony could collect the equivalent pollen resources as 100,000 solitary bees. So think about that, and in the context of if we have hives everywhere, how is that impacting the 512 native bee species? Thank you. And secondly, the other piece that I want to talk about is the prevalence of bee lawns is primarily supporting non-native honeybees. The Dutch white clover, the primary plant that persists in bee lawns, is a non-native plant that is heavily favored by honeybees. And with the visitation of honeybees to floral resources, there is the potential that they can deposit pathogens on these shared resources that native bees also will visit. So if you would like to learn more about the ecological harm and impacts of honeybees and how that relates to bee lawns, I encourage you to watch the video by the Xerxes Society called "We Need to Talk About Honeybees." All right, so if we were to look at a spectrum of bee habitat, starting with pavement, that is on the low end of the spectrum, followed by the second thing, which is something slightly better than pavement, a chemically treated lawn, right? So both of these two things is not going to provide good habitat for bees. Moving up, if we look at a no-mow lawn or a lawn that is managed without synthetic chemicals, you're getting slightly better, but it is still not considered bee habitat. Bee lawns come in just beyond a non-chemical lawn, and arguably they could be about the same, because as Ren mentioned, bee lawns are primarily made up of non-native species. And now we move along the spectrum to non-native gardens. So if a garden is completely planted with non-native plants, then it's not supporting those 40% of native bees that rely on native plant pollens. If we have a mostly native garden, we're getting a lot better, right? We're starting to have a diversity of plants that are mostly native. That type of garden would be supporting these pollen specialists. And then if we look at a natural area or park, and that can be wide-ranging in its capacity to support pollinators, whether it's heavily degraded or a high-quality area. And lastly, a high-quality remnant is really going to be a rare remnant with rare plants and rare habitat is going to likely support the highest bee diversity. So if we look at all those things, gardens are really the sweet spot for what we as individuals can do. And what I want to highlight a project that I think is a very tangible and first step project that many people can consider. And this was an idea generated by my friend Leslie Pilgrim of Neighborhood Greening, who happens to be here in the audience tonight. And she was following a lot of the work of Doug Tallamy. And Doug Tallamy is promoting keystone plants. And keystone plants for Doug Tallamy's research are plants that support a high number of lepidopteran larvae. So in other words, butterfly and moth caterpillars. And he noted that only 14% of plant genera are supporting 90% of these caterpillars. And so Leslie said to me one day, she said, why isn't Doug talking about what happens to these caterpillars when they're ready to pupate? Because many caterpillars, after feeding on the foliage, either stay on the host plant or disperse from the host plant. And when they disperse from the host plant, of course, they need viable habitat in order to move into their next stage of metamorphosis, into pupation. And so, next slide, please. So Leslie said, why wouldn't it be a great idea, or it is a great idea, to put a planting right under the keystone tree that is supporting all these caterpillars? And so she coined these plantings soft landings. And here is a wonderful example of a soft landing. And so we put our heads together, we came up with a plant list, and planting a variety of different low-growing native flowering plants underneath the tree starts to teach people about this ecosystem and life cycles of all of these different insects, both herbivores and pollinating insects. So if you'd like to learn more about what plants you could utilize in a soft landings planting, you can find our plant list on that URL on the slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Dan will speak next.
Do anything? What if I do this? Yeah, I was a little distracted by Heather thinking about how many bees I could name. I think I could do better than 5, but I'm not sure. So I'm Dan Tix with M&L, Minnesota Native Landscapes, formerly. Now we're going by M&L mostly. And we grow and sell our own native seeds and plants. We have a lot of our own seed mixes. Do you have that PDF that I'd provided? If not, the pictures will be fine. Heather kind of covered it already anyway. So what I wanted to kind of start on, I think that's kind of what everybody will talk about here is lawns or drug-dependent carpets. We don't really think are good in any way, shape, or form. And if you go to a bee lawn, it's definitely taking a step up. It's definitely better, especially if you reduce the inputs of how much mowing you're doing, how much fertilizing, how much chemical you're applying to keep it alive and healthy, and how much water. But the best is going to be native plants in wild settings, in large areas as much as possible where they have supporting habitat around them. In many cases, in a lawn and in a neighborhood, we can't control what's around us, but we can control what's on the ground near us, and minimize how much lawn we have and minimize how much chemical input we give it, how many drugs we feed it. But so the M&L, we do sell bee lawn seed mixes. It is something we buy from other suppliers and distribute partly just because we feel like it's our place to do so, be part of the Lawns to Legumes program, but we don't really endorse them very much. We mostly will be endorsing our own native seeds and plants and finding ways to work them into your landscape, into your spaces that is pleasing to you and is pleasing in a way that that is acceptable to your neighbors. I think what is important about the Lawns to Legumes program is that it has given people this other perspective and this other opportunity to say, lawns kind of stink, and I don't want to have to maintain it anymore. And it's giving people that freedom to do it, to change their lawn out. M&L has a variety of different seed mixes that we sell that can be used in landscape settings. Many of them are short grass, many of them have high forb content and are good for pollinators. I do think one place that people, individuals, and organizations or groups run into a problem sometimes where they think they can provide habitat for all 512 species in Minnesota just by putting in every single plant around. And I think it's important to consider what is a native plant. And here, one example I like to think about, it's the simplest example, I think. In Minnesota, Canadian hemlock is a native plant, but it is a very limited range. It's very few of them. And so planting it in Bloomington or in Chanhassen, it's not an appropriate native place for it. It is not a native plant to the metro area. Maybe it was a long, long time ago. It's not anymore. And the climate and habitat is not right. And one reason it makes it not as beneficial as other native plants like oaks is it doesn't support the community, the pollinators, the other insects, the fungi, everything that goes with those trees don't come here when you plant them there. When you plant an oak, there's plenty of those animals and fungi around that can hopefully get established near your oak tree and become part of that thriving ecosystem. Another thing is that the hemlock or other non-native species isn't going to thrive. It's not going to reproduce on its own. So I like to make sure it's clear what native plants are, and I get a little bit too picky about it sometimes. I burn some bridges, I think, sometimes. But yeah, I think if you're looking for native plants, M&L is a great place. There's other good suppliers too. Look on our website. We've got a lot available, and we're adding more every year, including several species this year that are grown in our Lonsdale facility, which is south of the metro, which just means it'll kind of expand the range of the species we're providing. So I think that's all I have. Mm-hmm.
I'm Andy Scott, and as Ren mentioned, I have a small landscaping business called Rewild Gardens. We work primarily in the metro area, although I do consultations further out. If you are, in the greater Minnesota area, we sometimes get out there to consult with people too. So we do a lot of consultations, and regardless of whether we're working with you to do installation or design, we will always do a consultation. And a big part of that ends up being, well, how do I start this? Or, I did a bee lawn and I want to do a bee lawn. What does that look like and how do I start? When bee lawns or alt lawns first kind of came into the conversation a few years ago, no one really knew. And I didn't really have any good examples of what that looked like, but the best thing I could think of was like, I don't know, like a pasture. Like, you could go out in the country and you had alfalfa growing or you had Dutch white clover growing in your lawn. That was sort of what the idea was. But now we've come to realize like we're really overthinking it. I just tend to tell people it's like a miniature prairie. So think about a prairie that gets no taller than your ankles or your shins. It can be mowed, it cannot be mowed, but you're still picking things that are going to be shorter in stature. You can advance to the next slide if you'd like, please. And I think when I say we're overthinking it, I want to go back to like talking about no mow May. So we all thought that was a great idea. Just stop mowing and see what happens. Turns out the stuff that's already in our high input lawns and our traditional landscapes is not the best stuff. So you don't mow your lawn in May, you got a ton of dandelions and a bunch of other stuff you don't want growing in there. No mow May works when you have the right things to not mow. So this is an example of our lawn in the front yard. This didn't just happen. So this took many seasons of using a guiding hand to kind of shape the plants that are in my lawn. So it wasn't just a matter of no mow May, it was a matter of getting rid of the stuff that wasn't supposed to be in there. I don't want a lawn full of dandelions that are gonna blow into my neighbor's yard. I don't want a lawn full of creeping Charlie that's gonna be a mess to deal with and offers no pollinator benefits. I do want things like phlox and violets and asters to grow in my lawn because those are lower growing species, they're very drought tolerant, they can be mowed, and they're beautiful. So I think when I say we're overthinking it, look at what's there, look at what you have to do, look at what you have to work with, and then be that guiding hand. So remove the stuff that's not supposed to be there, nurture the stuff that you want to be there, and add as you can. So that was the kind of story of our lawn, where it took a couple years and seasons to get there. But I also work closely with clients to develop solutions for their properties as well. So we do use seed mixes. This is common yarrow, which is a plant that's commonly available in some of the native bee lawn mixes. I love this plant. It's a green mossy carpet. It mows beautifully. If you don't mow it, it can grow about knee high, and it's a great pollinator source. You can plant this with just as a monoculture, as a turf replacement. You can mix it with fescues. You can mix it with other, flowering forbs. It's a really good solution. So sometimes we do start with those projects from scratch and work with those bee lawn mixes, and sometimes we look at what's there and kind of keep working with things. We talk about diversity a lot, so we really want to think about maybe what we have as a potential bee lawn is not just what's in those mixes. So I'm not saying that wild petunia might be the best plant for your bee lawn, but maybe it makes its way into your lawn, and maybe it can bloom a little bit in between the time that you're mowing it. This is an image from the park down the road from us, and this is just an area that was left to kind of go, and the violets that are in there were just there. Violets are something that, I don't know, like I think of like my grandma's backyard in South Minneapolis. She had violets everywhere. She loved them, the neighbors hated them. So it turns out violets are one of the best bee lawn plants you can have. They support Lepidoptera, which are those moths and butterflies. You'll notice that in times of drought, the violets might be the only green thing in your lawn. So really not discounting those things that are already maybe there. So this is an example of like if we are working with a client, this is sort of a case study of coming in. We're definitely not coming in and bombing it with Roundup or glyphosate. We are working with what's there. So if I look at a property and see that the lawn is, not overrun with creeping Charlie, maybe there's just some regular turf grass in there. We'll dethatch it. We will top dress with some compost, and then we'll work that beeline mix into there. So, and you can see the results on the right versus starting out on the left, and we've got some really good results with blooming and flowering in that first season. And as you can see, this is mowable, it's walkable. There's still turf in there, so it's very, very, very usable as a lawn space too. So you can advance another image of that project. You can advance again. So just quickly, I will, this is again my own lawn. The blue phlox that was in that earlier image was something that was sort of a happy accident. This white aster is another happy accident that sort of happened where it just sort of blew in from the park across the street. Asters, if you leave them alone, sort of like the yarrow, will grow a little taller, but if they're mowed semi-regularly throughout the season, beautiful low-growing plants. And I think in the next slide, next one down, you can see there's actually some bees foraging on it too. So it offers really great late season forage for those bees. So, and we can continue. You can keep going. I think I'm out of time. So we'll just talk a little bit about, you can go to the last slide. So just to kind of recap, I guess the biggest thing I would leave people with is if you are going to try to start any sort of native landscape or naturalized landscape, let's really think about intention and legibility. We're dealing with trying to create a cultural shift here, make these landscapes more widely known, maybe make them the new norm. So if you are a new resident and you move to a suburb where there's like a lot of lawn and you're not really sure how your neighbors are going to receive that, one way that can be really helpful is to just make sure you're going about things really intentionally. Don't go crazy at first. Don't get one of every plant like we kind of mentioned before. Maybe just keep things a little simpler to start with, and make sure that garden is really well maintained, and that the things that are supposed to be growing in there are growing in there. It also makes it more manageable for you as a gardener as well. So don't be afraid to rock the boat a little bit, but you don't want to rock it too hard. You want your gardens to feel approachable and comfortable for your neighbors. And think about the right plant in the right place. The other thing I would say is that you really need to trust in nature, and I talk a little bit about like slow gardening. So that approach we took with our lawn was a slow gardening approach. So not just coming in with a clean sweep, knocking everything out, but really looking at what's there, if it's workable, identifying what's working and what's not, and then letting nature kind of, move in as needed, but being a guiding hand for that nature. And then finding that balance, and then the resilience will follow. So we build resilience by, planting the drought-tolerant plants, things like that, but also as those plants start to do their job, we're getting better levels in our soil, so our phosphorus levels are being regulated, our nitrogen levels are regulating out, so we're having a healthier soil ecosystem as well. That's when you get resilience. That's when your soils are less prone to erosion, and have a higher nutrient, a higher nutrient cycle for a healthy garden. So, so those are just some things to think about. Really. Be the one that wants to make change in your community, but just to do so intentionally. And if you are if you're in a community that's like has an HOA or something, or a community that doesn't have resources, join the HOA, get on the HOA board, join the commission. Those are ways you can make change in your community and get to know your neighbors as well. So, thank you.
I'd like to start by saying I didn't get the memo that said I could provide slides, so I apologize. Which means if I go over time, please tell me. I usually use my slides to guide me. So when Lawns to Legumes first came out, my big concern was not the mix, although it was a concern, was that communities across Minnesota weren't ready for lawns to legumes because most lawn ordinances would not allow lawns to legumes, especially if there were taller mixes used. When I first moved to the Twin Cities, I knew that I wanted to remove most of the sod in my yard and replace it with native plants or an alternative landscape. So, and that was what I was asked to talk about, alternative landscapes. And I knew that most lawn ordinances are not policed by the community that you're in. They are complaint-driven. If your neighbor doesn't like you or doesn't like what you're doing in your lawn, neighbor can call your city and say, hey, they're letting weeds grow in their yard, and the city then has to do something about it, which means you end your planting. So I was proactive and went to the city of Minnetonka and said, hey, I really would like to help you revise your lawn ordinance to allow for natural or alternative lawns. And since then, they've been, they accepted that and they changed it. So I also, of course, went to all my neighbors and told them what I was up to. So when I killed all the sod in my front yard, they were not appalled and didn't shout and scream or report me either. And in fact, I've gotten lots of compliments from neighbors since then. Young couple moved in across the street recently and said the reason they moved, bought the house across the street, was because I had an alternative lawn in my front yard, which was the highest compliment I've ever gotten. Anyway, what is an alternative lawn? I'll tell you 3 things that it isn't. It is not going out in the wild and digging up native plants to put in your yard. When I was a kid, about 15, that's exactly what I did. Not knowing anything at all, I just wanted to have a wildflower garden. And I went out and Mom told me I could plant along the east side, which was the shady side. I went out into the woods and found shade-tolerant plants. I very carefully dug them up with big spoons, got as much of the soil and humus around it, transplanted them back, and grew just fine. But what I didn't know, and didn't know until I went to school much later, 15 years later, that I had damaged a native natural habitat for my own pleasure, which all those holes that I dug so carefully were probably later filled with invasive plants. So, an alternative lawn isn't one you dig from the wild. It also isn't one that you just let go wild. Okay, I've seen that tried, and if you're living in an urban or suburban community, your soils have been damaged so much, they've been turned upside down and all around through all the development that's happened. And what you get when you let things go wild are a lot of invasive species, a lot of weeds. And the third thing that's not an alternative lawn is no mow May. I'm sorry, but please do not do no mow May. It's not only dandelions, but Creeping Charlie has really gone crazy in my neighborhood as a result of no mow May. And it's just not an acceptable bee lawn or alternative lawn. So what is an alternative lawn? What we did was plant native plants native to this part of Minnesota, this region, all sun-loving plants because it was a sunny side of the property. It doesn't have to be an entire front yard like ours are. And by the way, every planting is an experiment. You're going to learn a lot in the process, which is part of the fun of it. You need to assess, the kinds of soils you have, whether they're sandy, loamy, clayey. what kind of moisture availability they have, and what kind of light they have. For example, mine was sunny, kind of between loam and clay, and so I found a prairie model or a preserve. There are lots of preserves in the Minnesota area that you can go visit. Visit a prairie, a wetland, or a woodland that is similar to your site, and find out what kinds of forbs, flowers, and grasses are growing in it, and use it as a model. It's fun going to visit preserves in the first place, but finding things that you like, that you would like in your front yard, seeing them in nature is a wonderful way of falling in love with your garden before you even start planting it. Anyway, so my garden is over 30 years old, and what I found when I was trying to record what happened over those years, that these insects kept landing in my photo shots. And it was like, what the heck, you know, I didn't know any of them. Well, I know more than 5 now, too. But they especially landed in this landing zone right here because they thought this was obviously a big white flower. In the 30-some years, not one bee has ever stung me. Not one, okay? For those people who fear that attracting bees and other insects are going to be a problem for you, you leave them alone, they leave you alone. Anyway, when you're doing these plantings, especially if you're doing the forbs wildflowers part of it, and I have to say that way back in the beginning when we talked about alternative lawns, we always thought them as being native plants. And so that is my bias, but I can see where there are times when you might just want to enhance an existing traditional garden with horticultural plants, and I don't see a problem with that either. As I said, every garden is an experiment. So see what works for you and what flowers that you really enjoy. But don't forget the grasses. The grasses are an important part of these mixes. Pollinators need grasses too for habitat and shelter. Plus, aesthetically, you will find that if you're planting forbs and grasses, the grasses help give structure to the forb planting. They help hold up some of those plants that might get wild and woolly if they don't have the grasses in the mix. And it adds this nice fine texture that helps as a background behind those wildflowers. So don't forget the grasses, please. They're an important constituent of all of this. And that's pretty much it. My alternative lawn has become a bee lawn, has become a pollinator lawn. Wasn't my intent 30 years ago, but it's alive and well and really pretty exciting every season.
Thank you. That was a great presentation for each of you, and you've really covered and taught me a lot about what are alternative lawns, and the scope is pretty exciting. So this part of our discussion is where we're taking a cut at the Nobel Conference, which is in Gustavus down in Minnesota. And after each speaker talks, they set up the chairs and the speakers come out, all of the speakers for the conference, and ask each other questions and discuss what they have learned. And so this is the style that we are doing tonight. I will be putting in questions as is needed, but it really is to have more of a presentation rather than me ask the questions and have an answer. So if you also have questions as we go along and there's a pause, we do want to hear from you as well. So anybody have an opening comment? Or I can begin it.
I'll start. I wanted to touch on what Andy talked about, and also Bonnie, the intentionality of a project or planting. And that the no mow May idea is that doing nothing somehow miraculously produces this wonderful pollinator habitat. And in our urban, suburban context, everything needs intentionality and purpose and stewardship. I think that's something to keep in mind, so thank you for mentioning that.
I was thinking on the same thing, and what I like to tell people when they're thinking that or wishing they didn't have to manage the native landscape that they just put in, like, oh, can't we just plant it and forget it and leave it alone? And the fact is, if you do that, you're going to be getting buckthorn, you're going to get box elder. It's going to be horrible in 5-10 years. So no matter what you do, you have to manage it. Not managing now in this world, especially in the urban area, is a management decision. And it's not a good one.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially with, our weather patterns swing so wildly, so our natural systems are under a lot of stress. Even our traditional high input lawns are under way more stress. So, so if we can build that resiliency, and that's a really important thing. And so a lot of what I deal with clients is they have these really high input lawns, and then they get grubs that come in. So we've had a lot of grub issues. And then what can I do about the grubs? And I'm like, well, you've got this stressed situation, and you've decided you want to take the leap and not treat your yard for insects with pesticides, but everybody else in your neighborhood is. So all of the grubs are coming into your lawn, and and then the turkeys come and the raccoons come and they're digging everything out. And so we have these wildly out of balance situations, and it's hard to get people to understand that this is going to take some time to get a hold on. But these more diverse alternative lawns are going to be more resilient because they're not a monoculture of one thing. You don't have grubs coming in that just want to eat lawn roots. You've got other things in there that are going to be less tasty to those things. So, so that is something to think about. So, and back to the this no mow May thing too. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there was there's been some conversation like the lazy lawn thing too, and there are people who think dandelions are great, and Heather, I know you can talk a lot about how dandelions are not great for pollinators. They don't put what we're doing in a good light. So just letting things go, letting those dandelions bloom and then go to seed, it's not going to be putting this movement, it's not going to help us at all. It's just going to hinder. People kind of laugh at me because I have the rewild garden, right? So I have like the naturalized, meadowy, prairie kind of looking grass. But I'm out there with my little dandelion picker, or I've got a helper helping me get every single dandelion out of my lawn because I just don't want people to think that that's the norm, that that's going to be the okay thing to do. So,
maintenance is important, and you've definitely hit on it. Now I just forgot what I was going to tell you. I was so into you. But yeah, especially dandelions. In my previous life, I worked with highway rights-of-ways and roadsides, which meant I drove a lot of highways all around the country. And I have seen abandoned fields and pastures, 20, 40 acres at a time of solid dandelions. Dandelions are becoming an invasive species in this country that nobody's watching, but at least maybe we could do our part in the urban environment.
There's a public space, I'm not going to put anybody on blast, but there's a well-known public space in Apple Valley, Minnesota. We were there visiting, and they have a sign. This is a no mow bee lawn, project, and it was just dandelions, nothing but dandelions, and it was just a complete disaster. So yeah, that's definitely on the radar too. So talking about that legibility and that stewardship and that intentionality in these plantings is really important. Again, it's worth reiterating we want these spaces to feel approachable, and they shouldn't be uncomfortable for people to come up to your front door and look at all the stuff. So that's just something that I do like to reiterate to people as well.
Another compliment, I think, was when I found a neighbor in my front yard picking this wonderful bouquet of blue asters, and it was kind of like, wait a second, you could have at least asked. But anyway, she was having a good time, and they were beautiful.
Words that grow in shade, and could you talk about what you might advise? Could you have a question?
Just repeat.
Could you repeat the question? We've talked a lot about plants for sunny areas, and I'm wondering what you would have to add about shade. And I just mentioned that the soft landings information has lists of various kinds of plants, including plants that grow in the shade and sedges. And I'm wondering what our panel might add to that.
Well, Andy, you already touched on your woodland phlox and violets, which are included in soft landings recommendations. And as you mentioned, sedges, which are very well known to some people and new to others. And they're basically a cool season grass-like plant that greens up early or even stays green throughout the winter in some cases. And so it's a really, and many of them can be fairly drought tolerant and fairly shade tolerant. And they mix nicely into soft landings, partial shade or shady planting, in some cases replacing that grass matrix that would be present in a sunnier environment, such as a prairie. So I'll let others to pick out some shade plants.
Sure, yeah, there's just a lot of species of sedges, most of them being wetland species, but there are several that work really great in woodland, upland settings in the shade. Like I think of pen sedge as just spreading lovely and making a nice carpet, but it's very hard. We haven't been able to produce it by seed, and then we can't really grow it very easily either. So it ends up being a lot of cuttings and a top seller that is hard to come by at some point. So, but there's others, the starry sedge and sorry, I know them by Latin name sometimes more than not. So, but yeah, they really are great. And then there's just a lot of woodland plants that do bloom throughout the season. We normally think of the spring ephemerals, like the phlox and trillium, and bloodroot is one of my personal favorites. But then there's others that bloom in late summer. There's many asters that do. In the middle of summer, it's a little harder to find, but there are a few that do bloom in the middle of summer.
The thing I'd add is that these shady areas a lot of times are really tough areas to get anything to grow in. So a lot of times they're under the drip line of trees, or they're on the north side of the house, or they're in non-desirable areas for lawn as we know it. So they can offer their own challenges of retaining moisture, things like that. So I don't recommend amending soil necessarily, but really thinking about like what's holding moisture into those areas. Are there a lot of surface roots? Is it under a silver maple? Things like that. So really looking at the site too, and addressing those issues too, rather than just kind of throwing plants at the, sedges are, you mentioned sedges. I think that a lot of us would agree those are they're kind of the silver bullet in a lot of those areas, because there's a sedge for every, just like milkweeds, there's a milkweed for every situation, there's a sedge for every situation. And if we keep it under this idea of alternative lawn, I think Pennsylvania sedge is probably going to be the winner, you know, for most areas. But again, really look at your soil. A lot of times they're so mineralized and they're so compacted under those trees, especially if it was lawn and it was getting mowed around, things like that. So really work on getting that soil healthy, bring in some organic matter, some leaves, things like that, to let things grow. So.
We're lucky enough to have a backyard that is a relatively undisturbed native red oak, black cherry, ironwood combination woodland, and on the north-facing slope, there's just beaucoup Pennsylvania sedge everywhere. It's just beautiful. Has this really fine texture, grows in little clumps. It would be hard to make a solid lawn of it because it is a clumpy growth pattern, but it's a wonderful, wonderful sedge, and lots of other sedges grow in that area too. And when we weren't even, all that we've done in that backyard wooded areas to get rid of the invasive plants like buckthorn, honeysuckle, a little barberry, garlic mustard in particular. And what has happened is things are coming up that we didn't even know were there. Plants that I have not seen in the wild, I have found in my own backyard after removing the invasive species. One example is a nodding trillium. I've never stumbled onto them in the wild, and we now have nodding trilliums expanding their population in the backyard. Another is woods sedge, a sedge that I don't know sedges well, to be quite honest, but a sedge that I did not know. And when I told the state botanist about it, he came out and collected a sample immediately for the herbarium because he said it was the only site known in Hennepin County, in my backyard. So the surprises just keep coming. So, I mean, am I excited about going native, so to speak? Yeah, it's something new every year. And don't get me started on the insects because they've been really one of the funnest parts of all to getting to know. I mean, I grew up in rural Wisconsin. I knew what bumblebees were. That was kind of it. And now, goodness, I don't know, I've got photos of at least 50, 60, 70 different insects that I've just met in my own front yard, my new friends.
So I'd like to address a question to the panel, particularly to Dan, because M&L creates some of the seed mixes. When people ask me what to do about a mown lawn, which of course is that area that everybody wants to have from a distance to look like a lawn and a landscape, I always suggest to them that they find the fescue or whatever mix it is they have for grass that meets their site conditions, and then overseed it with waves of seeds of native plants at the time they're seeding, so they build in that diversity at the same time that they're seeding. I was told that the reason those kinds of seed mixes don't exist is because of the expense of the aster seeds or the mint seeds or some of the seeds that would really work well in those environments. Is there any work being done, Dan, to develop packages where somebody could purchase? I know that you have one at M&L where you add the plugs of the pussy toes, where you do a mix with plugs, or where you do that grass mix and then you give them packages for doing these waves as kind of a kit. I just think that would be a great way to solve that diversity issue and bring more forbs into the grass. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. As far as if there's work being done, I would just say that our greenhouse folks are always trying to grow something new, and they're always trying to make it work in the growing fields where we can produce the seed and where we can produce the plants, and they as much as they can do, they want to do it. But these mixes tend to be pretty limited and like you said, expensive, because things like pussy toes, just you can't grow them by seed. And it's very difficult to produce a seed of prairie smoke. Those things that really stay nice and low, it's really hard. They don't produce the seed like we'd like them to. Certainly not like black-eyed Susan. You know, you can get that seed everywhere, and you can put it in the mix and you can mow it and you'll just get the leaf. You will, maybe if you stop mowing it for a while, you will let it produce a head and flower. But yeah, and you know, like yarrow too. I was impressed by some of the things you had in those mixes, and I was gonna ask you more about that, in fact, have you worked on a mix or tried to put together your own mixes?
Yeah, so there's a few mixes readily available by the U of M Bee Lab that are marketed and sold at, you know, the garden centers around town. The one that we primarily use consists of yak yarrow, which is a dwarf selection, I believe, or a subspecies of native wild yarrow. It's selected to grow a little more compact, so it's shorter, which makes it more friendly for bee lawns. But it still has that really lovely foliage. It has self-heal prunella. It has, I think it includes the eco-grass, the fescue, the deep-rooted fescue mix. But it also includes blue-eyed grass, which is a native wildflower in the iris family. I don't know where it's growing. It's not growing here. So I'm not seeing it really work in that bee lawn mix. So when I go and buy that bee lawn mix, I'm realizing that like a certain percentage of that seed is really not gonna work for me. So what we've done is we kind of make our own at this point. So we just buy like a bulk bag of like eco-grass. I've got a big bag of self-heal. I've got some yarrow. What I would love to get my hands on is just a big bag of violet seeds. But apparently violets that grow everywhere in all of our yards, the seeds are super hard and super expensive to get to collect and to get, you know, large quantities of. So every time I'm working with a seed supplier, I'm like asking them, can we get some violet? You know, sometimes Prairie Moon will have a glut available and we'll get some Prairie Moon seed for violets and things like that. But that's really the thing I want to put in my bee lawn mix is the violets. So, so we kind of just, you know, kind of scramble together what we can of those sort of 3 to 5 species. But, you know, like I said earlier, a lot of things can be in a bee lawn. So it doesn't necessarily just need to be that thing you grab off the shelf. And that said, I just want to, while I'm reminded of that, I have it in my notes. One of the biggest things that we deal with clients is in relation to bee lawns or alternative lawns is I'll go in and do a consultation and they'll be like, oh, I just installed a bee lawn last year. Look at it. And it's all Dutch white clover. And I know we touched briefly on Dutch white clover, but as we've now understand, it's really only benefiting European honeybees, which are, you know, if we're looking at supporting native invertebrates, that's not really helpful for that. Also, it's incredibly aggressive. So it grows in my yard that, you know, we inherited some with the property. We never seeded it. It's just as difficult to weed out of my lawn as Creeping Charlie is, if not even worse. To even make matters worse, a lot of our lawn areas already, our residential lawn areas, already have a really high level of nitrogen. Clover is a legume, it's nitrogen fixing. Your lawn doesn't need more nitrogen. Your lawn needs less nitrogen. So when people tell me that, it's hard because, you know, you never want to go into this interaction with them saying like, oh, you did the wrong thing, you know. So it's hard to kind of get people to understand like the main thing you reach for when you go to the store to get that bee lawn mix or alt lawn mix should not be Dutch white clover. It should absolutely be any other, you know, alternative for wildflower mix that is native, potential, you know, hopefully native, hopefully it consists of those species that we've already mentioned. Or even just yarrow, or even just eco-grass, something like that, sedges, you know, something like that. But that's a behavioral a behavior that I'm noticing with homeowners where they want to do the right thing. They're really excited about doing a bee lawn, and they go to the store and they get the white clover right away. So just kind of think about that just in the same way if you're going to seed a wildflower meadow. Where is your seed coming from? Are you sourcing it from a seed company that has harvested their seed and grown their seed from, plants that are native to the Midwest or native to Minnesota? Or is this stuff that's wildflower mix from the big box store that could be anything? So those are questions that, I think if we ask them of our suppliers, if we ask for it, they will supply it. So we're asking for no neonicotinoids, no pesticides in our plant material. Let's ask for better seed from our nurseries and our seed suppliers too. So.
I'd like to respond to the blue-eyed grass. I grew up with it in western Wisconsin and could find it every spring, summer, growing on a southwest facing sandy slope. Likes sand, likes full sun, and yeah, it's one of my favorites too. But I also wanted to feed into the idea of availability of seed. To this day, although some of us have been working with native seeds since the 1970s, there still isn't a large enough seed supply, native seed supply in the United States to accommodate all of the projects that are waiting out there. The National Academy of Sciences just in 2023 did an assessment across the country and came up with the idea that if indeed all of the potential users of native seed worked with potential growers of native seed so that native seed growers would know that they have a definite market for their seed and have enough lead time to produce that seed, we would suddenly have a lot more growers in this country. And so that is a direction that we're heading, fortunately. Quick question to Heather. So, we're talking about all these seed mixes, and so many of them aren't native. You mentioned most of the native pollinators having evolved with certain plant species. Do you not see then there a real problem with a lot of the existing seed mixes that even if they say Midwestern seed, they are not Midwestern species? I don't know that we can do anything about it, but I mean, other people have told me, oh yeah, no, bees can, use anything, and I'm saying, I don't think so.
Yeah, so for the specialists, there's a range of specialization. So some are, a handful of genera in the same plant family. We have a number of goldenrod and aster specialists. So those specialists will visit goldenrods if you plant it in your garden, in some cases, that are native to Wisconsin and not Minnesota, right? So there are some cases that does work, but then to your point, Bonnie, in other cases, they're very strict specialists, so they likely wouldn't be utilizing a native plant from 3 states over that they specialize. Cultivars is still up in the air. Most of the research looking at and comparing straight native species to cultivars looks at just insect visitation alone. And so they haven't quantified what specifically the insect is doing while visiting the flower, if it's a male or female, if it's a female, if it's collecting pollen or just nectar feeding. There, to my knowledge, hasn't been any real analysis of the comparison of the nutritional quality between a cultivar and a straight species. So has the pollen protein content changed with cultivation or a hybridization of or selection of a certain plant that's cultivated? So a lot of unknowns or not many answers yet. So.
A lot left to learn.
Well, and the thing with cultivars is we're reshaping things, we're reformulating things. I mean, we don't know the impact, so why are we even doing it? I mean, everything we're doing is for nature. So just like, let nature take the lead here, and just, you know, it's just it's a silly thing when you think about it. And you start seeing these cultivars in a native planting, and if you really start to look at, you know, a natural landscape, they just don't fit. They don't fit in. So really think about when you're picking out plants. I always tell people, like, you know, does this look like it belongs? If you were to look at like a picture book of a prairie, does this plant look like it belongs in there? And a lot of the powwow wild echinacea is not going to look like it belongs. So, and God knows what that's doing to the poor bees. You know, they're trying to like forage, you know, through all the extra petals and things like that. So, and also back to the neonicotinoids, those systemic pesticides, those cultivars are likely containing those pesticides too. So they're kind of a double whammy. Like, just don't plant them.
Yeah, I was going to say Dan can talk about seed sourcing, because we're so fortunate here in Minnesota and the Midwest to have so many native plant nurseries and growers, and a place such as MNL is citing what county the seed was sourced from. So.
We do have one more question over here.
Can you hear me?
Before we jump
Okay.
to that, could we let Dan answer?
Oh, I don't know that I had too much to say to that, but yeah, I think that is an important thing. Is the plants you get should be able to say where they're coming from. That's how you know they're native. It doesn't necessarily mean they're native to where you are, especially if they come from, you know, South Dakota. But yeah, you can tell that they're native and a wild selection if you know that they have a source location with them. And if they're not showing that, which M&L on retail side, we often don't show it until we provide the seed tag itself. You can ask for it up front to make sure you get it.
And then I believe there was a question.
Yes, my name is Gail Hudson, and I am a contributing writer for Northern Gardener magazine and a Minnesota State Horticultural Society board member. And I am working on an article about bee lawns. And I understand there are a variety of perspectives on bee lawns. One person I've interviewed through the North Dakota State University Extension feels that there are a lot of people who don't want to go through the work of putting in a native garden, and feels that to move the needle and have a more realistic approach on bee lawns might be required. So my question for the panelists is, how would you finish the sentence? Bee lawns are blank. How would you fill that in?
Well, I think my presentation slides maybe answered that. Bee lawns are one step up from a chemical lawn, or two steps up from concrete, right? So they're still pretty low on the spectrum of providing a high diversity of flowering plants, ensuring that you have flowering plants blooming throughout the growing season. So they don't check a lot of boxes of what the simplest terms you would think of is pollinator habitat.
But that's sort of I'm assuming, so on the spectrum, that bee lawn was sort of more like a Dutch white clover, right? Or a monoculture, right? So that's the context in bee lawn there. We're really more interested in a diverse alternative lawn. Yeah. So whether you want to call that a bee lawn, it's likely not the box you're going to go get at, the big box store, but it's a diverse planting of very small, lower growing plants that can handle regular mowing, that can handle, being treated as a traditional lawn from time to time, but they're going to be more climate resilient. They're going to be more drought tolerant. They're going to help with carbon sequestering. They're going to help with a lot of different solutions that we are concerned with ecosystem services and aiding pollinators. So it's not a very simple answer, but I think that's kind of why we're here, right? So, and I think the simple answer is the problem with bee lawns, because bee lawns were the box or the bag of the Dutch white clover. And we're pushing really hard for people to understand that they've got to be more than that, and they can be more than that. So, yeah, that's not a very elegant or simple answer, but I think that's kind of my contribution to that.
And what I would like to add is I began my whole talk about alternative lawns, which turned into be a pollinator lawn or a bee garden, as ripping out my entire front yard. It doesn't have to be anything that dramatic. You can have small spaces. I have like a 10 by 10 mailbox garden of native plants, which is one of my best photography spots, actually. There are also rain gardens and roof gardens. You can start out with something very small to see if it's something that you really want to get into. And yes, some maintenance is required. I call it editing. And every year I go out and edit a bit. But other than that, start small. You don't have to go big to do this kind of thing.
I was going to say bee lawns are a gateway to something better. And I was going to ask, your diverse lawns with the natives, would you see those as being, wonderful soccer fields and play spaces, or not quite?
I mean, I've played lawn games and soccer on some pretty poor turf, so I don't think you need like high grade, I don't know, what is it, like type AA turf or whatever to play a soccer game. So, yeah, I mean, it depends on like I say, growing up, we had a family cabin in Alexandria, Minnesota. It was formerly pasture land. That, we never thought about it. It was a bee lawn. It had clover, it had self-heal, it had violets, it had all that stuff in there. We never thought about it, but that was, we played plenty of soccer games on that. So I think, the usability of these spaces is something to account for, and obviously, if your lawn consists of wild geranium and phlox and these more delicate sort of things, you're not going to be playing soccer on that. But if it consists of yarrow and self-heal and some fescue and things like that, absolutely you can, So, so there's really no one model. Just as we wouldn't design a native plant for one, like one native planting for every property, there's no one bee lawn for every property either. So that's why it's important to really look at your like the things that I talk about with clients, the usability of the space, your soil conditions, your lighting conditions, all those design things that we talk about. Bee lawns are just another sort of way to think about that thing. So, so again, it's not an easy answer, but yeah, you could absolutely have a bee lawn that you mow and then you have a party. You mow and you have a picnic with your kids. It just depends on kind of how you've laid that out. So.
So I was wondering, oh, you do have a question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, one thing that concerns me about a bee lawn is when we put in those plants like violets and, help me out, pussy toes, even sedges, and then we mow it. I feel like we're trying to do this half habitat, half something you can walk on and mow, and it worries me that we're inviting wildlife in, and then maybe your pussy toes look lousy right when you shouldn't be touching them. And that's when you want to mow them down. So I think a bee lawn, people really need to know what they're planting. Otherwise, I always hate this concept of inviting things in and then taking it away. So.
Yeah, well, it's like the neonicotinoids all over again, right? Where you have this beautiful flower and it's toxic. So it's the same idea, right? And I think education. And so she was asking, are we sort of setting nature up for failure by having a bee lawn that's so tempting for nature, and then it's something that we're going to be mowing and maintaining in that way. So, so for me, this is another opportunity to educate and pick things intentionally. So if this is a high use area that's going to have a lot of action and things like that, and the client is saying like, I want a really short mowed, I want this thing mowed every month or whatever, then I'm not going to probably put those highly tempting pollinator host plants in that lawn. Then it's going to be probably more yarrow and more of those other things. That said, I'm going to say like, well, let's not mow as much. Maybe we're not mowing every week. Maybe we're mowing maybe once a month, if that even. So behavior change is the biggest part of this. And that's something that we really have to help people understand is like you have to change your definition of what is acceptable aesthetics, what is acceptable beauty. Still approachable, still intentional, but loosening the grip a little bit to let nature have space and making space for nature. So I totally agree that's an absolutely, an absolute concern because we don't want to lure things in and then go through and mow things down. That said, the whole point of this for me would be an educational opportunity to work with a client and say like, you can go out and see these caterpillars on your Entonaria. You can go see them living on these plants. And so before you mow, maybe go out and look. Maybe go out and just kind of check things out and see like, oh, there's something living on this wild petunia in the corner here. Maybe I shouldn't whack it down, So that to me is the whole sense of adventure and fun and engagement that we have with these gardens. So.
I would like to add, I think it's important for us to think about these outdoor spaces as important spaces for people to be as much as possible also, that we don't just make it something that we have to only look at that's only for wildlife. I'm a firm believer in allowing people to get out more often and in doing so that kind of snowballs and helps them appreciate the outdoors and appreciate nature more if they have a space where they can, even if it's just grilling and playing soccer or, a backyard game, whatever. It's so much better than them just thinking they have to look at it and not touch it or be afraid of it somehow. That making the space so that they can use it is as important as making it good for nature and good for water quality and all the other good things that we should be trying to do.
I just like to think we can do it all. And in our yard, we have pathways that go through the woods and through the prairie, so pollinators, squirrels, woodchucks, fox, and us all are enjoying those same spaces.
I was gonna say, I think it's a lesser of two evils thing too, right? So like, is a bee lawn that has some insects living in there that are great and beneficial. Let's say a homeowner does mow them down, and some of them survive. That's better than a high maintenance lawn that had nothing in it, So not that I ever want to see that happen or whatever, advocate for that to happen, but I'm just saying like, the negatives to that to me would outweigh, or the positives to that for me would outweigh the negatives of not having a resilient, nature-friendly lawn. So.
But I'll be the devil's advocate. So can we have a nature-friendly lawn, a no-mow lawn, a chemical-free lawn, and then to the person who asked the question, her point is if we're putting the flowering plants right in the lawn and we're mowing that and maintaining it in a different way and creating a sink, right? We're possibly harming the insects we want to attract through our maintenance practices. The ultimate sort of conundrum is these alternative bee lawn spaces are really complex and really require constant observation and knowledge of the editing and the stewardship. And that's really challenging, I think, for people versus if they were to plant 5 to 10 species in a small garden instead of the lawn, then it's, to her point, it's not a sink through your beginner sort of learning curve of maintenance practices, right? And not knowing what's there and harming it.
The hard part that the issue I run into a lot of times is with any sort of garden, people it gets tricky. Maintenance is hard. Plant identification is hard for some people, or they just don't want to do it. They want to feel like they're doing the right thing, but then you know, they get in too deep with a native garden or something like that. Maintenance goes out the window, the thing fails, it gives all of us a bad rap, right? So I think these alt lawns, they hit that sweet spot of something that if someone gets overwhelmed with it, and it starts to go kind of crazy, they can mow it and they can feel some control. I'm not disagreeing with your point, but I think, we've got 63,000 square miles of lawn. That's the size of Georgia, like in the country, and that's crazy. Like that's insane. So if we can get that turned into, even if it's just about resiliency and climate resiliency and carbon sequestration, that's a plus to me that like is such a massive shift in how we can have these landscapes function. That, you know, and trust me, you know me, I'm like the bug. I'm not an expert, but I love insects. And my hope is that when I work with clients and do outreach, I can get them to really, you know, not mow, don't mow it at all. You know, mow it once a year just to knock it back. You know, so. But yeah, I feel you. I get it, but I know that for a lot of people, those gardens are unmanageable. Even on a small scale, they can be too much.
So to that point, Andy, how do you coach, or do you provide recommendations to somebody how to maintain this sort of wilder space that's not mowed as often? Mm-hmm. What do you tell them as far as mowing frequency, or do you have certain specifications that you follow based on the particular flowering plants?
It depends on what's in there. So, you know, if it's things that are gonna, like, I probably wouldn't install an alt lawn with stuff that's gonna grow very tall for clients. So this is gonna be probably just regular bee lawn stuff. Ultimately, we want as hands-off as possible, especially, you know, as I've learned from you in the spring and the fall, when those bees are starting to nest and starting to go dormant and finding places or coming out of dormancy. We don't want to mess with those areas. We want to be hands-off. So those are not the times, you know. So looking at those times when insects are flying, so when they're out and about, they're not underground, so not early in the morning or I believe late in the evening, you know, when those insects are out foraging, that might be the best time to mow. But mowing as infrequently as possible during the season. So those bee lawn the plants that are in those bee lawn mixes that are designed to stay pretty short. Even that yakiero is designed to, it has been chosen to stay short. It shouldn't need constant regular mowing. So mow as infrequently as you can, but I tell you, I run into people who are addicted to mowing. So it's like really hard to find that balance of like, I really want to mow, but I want this. And where is that middle ground? So it's all about finding that middle ground.
Find a different hobby.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? Lawnmower racing, maybe. I don't know.
Woodworking. And I think on that note, it's a good time for us to wrap up. And I believe Julia's got some thoughts as a closing. And thank you so much.
I don't need to be on the camera. They can hear me. Thank you all our panelists. You know, when this idea popped up, it was the result of us wanting to give a member benefit, to be able to give a discount on some seeds. And of course, one of the seed mixes had Dutch white clover in it, and we started this conversation and says, wild ones just can't do that because we want the native mixes. And so we started this conversation, and Ren particularly partnered with me. It's almost like going back to Design with Nature days. I talked with Heather. Originally, she wasn't available, so we switched the date. And then, of course, we brought in all of these fine panelists. And as you can tell by the fact that they don't want to stop talking, this is a conversation we need to continue having. I love the idea of encouraging more companies to have seed, like Bonnie mentioned. I also love how Bonnie said go out in nature and look at those areas. My example of that is when I spent 2 different workshops out on Isle Royale, and I fell in love with big leaf aster and how it just carpeted that woodland floor. And I went home and I put big leaf aster in my small little 40 by 120 lot, which of course it takes over large spaces, but it is a survivor and it works in one of those lower settings. So I mean, there's examples that we see from nature, and I fell in love with that particular plant. And I also fell in love with just the idea of that landscape that is just naturalized. And so I think what everybody's saying here is we want to have an area of those lawns that becomes a naturalized area. And it's kind of hard to get that started. It takes that first 4 or 5 years of really tailoring it so that it gets the footing that it needs. But once it reaches that point, and you don't go in there and touch it other than to spot check for a tree seedling that you don't want, it is, in the long term, lower maintenance. In the short term, you have to get it established. I want to thank Ren for your partnership on this. Heather and Dan, I'm sorry about your slides. We had a little tech issue here where we put up the wrong one. And Bonnie, that we didn't get yours in there, and Andy as well. I just think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we can continue and maybe have a follow-up discussion somewhere where we can just kind of build from this, because there's been so many ideas and things that we can do better if we just find a way to move them forward. So thank you, everybody at home. And Ren, do you have any final comments?
I have learned so much in working with you. It has been a pleasure to talk with you and get to know what your work is a bit deeper. And I love the intentionality and the awareness that you are bringing to this subject. And I also appreciate all of you coming in here and online for your joining in. So thank you, and I hope you have a great evening.
The live stream is being recorded, so you can go back and listen to it or share it with your friends. And I don't know if we can figure out a way to get your slides in afterwards, I'm not sure. But thank you all for coming, and good night.
I do have some seed packets for handouts for